The sun beat down mercilessly on the rugged terrain of the Arizona desert in the spring of 18. A small group of Apache warriors moved silently through the canyon. Their leader, a man whose name would echo through history with both reverence and fear, Geronimo, the legendary Apache leader, had spent decades resisting the encroachment of both Mexican and American forces onto his people's ancestral lands. For years, Geronimo had led his band of Chiricahua Apache in a desperate struggle for survival and freedom. They had evaded countless military expeditions, using their intimate knowledge of the harsh desert landscape to outmaneuver forces that vastly outnumbered them. But on this particular day, fate would take an unexpected turn that would change everything. General George Crook, a seasoned military commander, had been pursuing Geronimo for months. Unlike many of his predecessors, Crook understood that conventional military tactics would not work against the Apache. He employed Apache scouts, men who knew the land as well as Geronimo himself. These scouts, though controversial among their own people, believed that continued resistance would only lead to the destruction of the Apache nation. The meeting that took place in the Canyon de los Embudos was unlike any that had occurred before. Geronimo, weary from years of running, agreed to negotiate. For 3 days, the two sides talked. Crook promised that if Geronimo surrendered, he and his people would be treated fairly and allowed to return to their homeland after a brief period of imprisonment. Geronimo, thinking of the women and children in his band, agreed to these terms. But the journey to the reservation would never be completed as planned. As Geronimo and his followers moved north under military escort, a whiskey trader intercepted the group. The trader, motivated by profit and indifferent to the consequences, sold alcohol to some of the Apache warriors, fearing that the promises made to them would not be kept, and their judgment clouded by drink. Geronimo and a small group of warriors fled back into the mountains. This escape infuriated the military establishment and embarrassed General Crook, who resigned his command in frustration. His replacement, General Nelson Miles, would take a different approach entirely. Miles deployed over 5,000 troops, nearly a quarter of the entire United States Army at the time, to capture Geronimo and his band of approximately 40 warriors, women, and children. For 5 months, this tiny group evaded the massive military force. They covered thousands of miles, moving between Arizona and Mexico, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers. The campaign cost the government millions of dollars, an astronomical sum for that era. Yet Geronimo remained free, a living symbol of Apache resistance. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, a man who had lived among the Apache and earned their respect, was given the dangerous mission of convincing Geronimo to surrender. Gatewood had to travel deep into Apache territory, with only a small escort, risking his life with every step. When he finally located Geronimo's camp in Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, the meeting was tense. Gatewood carried a message that would change everything. The government had already deported the rest of the Chiricahua Apache to Florida, including those who had served as scouts for the army. Geronimo's family was gone. The homes they had known were empty. Continued resistance meant nothing now except death. There was nowhere left to run, and no one left to fight for in Arizona. The news devastated Geronimo. The realization that his people had been betrayed, that even those who had helped the army were imprisoned, broke something inside the proud warrior. After hours of discussion, he agreed to meet with General Miles. On September 4, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona, Geronimo officially surrendered for the final time. The promises made to Geronimo during the surrender negotiations were broken almost immediately. Instead of being allowed to return to Arizona after a brief imprisonment, Geronimo and his followers were loaded onto trains and sent to Florida. The journey itself was traumatic. Many of the Apache had never seen a train before. They were paraded in front of curious crowds at every stop, treated as exotic prisoners rather than human beings. The conditions in Florida were catastrophic for the Apache people. The hot, humid climate was completely different from the dry desert they called home. Diseases swept through the imprisoned population. Tuberculosis, malaria, and other illnesses killed dozens. Children were torn from their parents and sent to boarding schools designed to strip away their culture and identity. Within the first year, dozens died, their bodies buried far from their homeland. Geronimo spent 8 years in Florida, then was moved to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. He would never see his beloved Arizona homeland again. The military kept him under guard for the rest of his life. 23 years of imprisonment for a man who had once roamed free across the southwestern deserts. But even in captivity, Geronimo remained a figure of fascination for the American public. People traveled from across the country to see him. He was paraded at expositions and fairs, including the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. He rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905, wearing a top hat and sitting in an automobile. A surreal image of the old warrior in the modern world. During these public appearances, Geronimo would sell photographs of himself and handmade bows and arrows. He became quite entrepreneurial, earning money any way he could. Some saw this as undignified, but Geronimo was doing what he had always done, surviving by any means necessary. He dictated his autobiography, telling his side of the story to a world that had only heard the version written by his captors. In his later years, Geronimo repeatedly petitioned the government to allow him to return to Arizona. Every request was denied. The settlers and ranchers who now occupied Apache lands did not want him back. They feared his presence would inspire resistance among native peoples. So Geronimo remained in Oklahoma, a prisoner in all but name. The legendary warrior died on February 17, 1909, at Fort Sill. He was 79 years old. The cause of death was pneumonia, contracted after falling from his horse while drunk and spending a cold February night lying on the ground. It was an ignoble end for a man who had been one of the most feared warriors in American history. But death did not bring Geronimo the peace he had sought in life. In 1918, during World War I, members of the Skull and Bones Society at Yale University allegedly raided his grave at Fort Sill. According to legend, they stole his skull and some other bones, taking them back to Yale as trophies for their secret society headquarters. This claim has never been definitively proven, but it has been the subject of legal action by Geronimo's descendants, who want his remains treated with respect. The story of Geronimo's capture and imprisonment reflects a dark chapter in American history. The systematic betrayal of promises made to Native Americans, the separation of families, the cultural genocide attempted through boarding schools, and the imprisonment of people who were simply defending their homeland. Geronimo became a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, but also of the tragedy that befell all native peoples during the westward expansion. Today, Geronimo's name is known around the world. Paratroopers shout it as they jump from planes. It appears in movies, books, and popular culture. But often, the real man and the real history are forgotten. Geronimo was not a savage or a villain. He was a leader who watched his people be slaughtered, his land stolen, and his way of life destroyed. His resistance was not terrorism, but a desperate fight for survival. The deadliest warriors who came for revenge were not Apache seeking to free their leader. They were the soldiers and settlers of an expanding nation, backed by the full might of the industrial age. They came with rifles, cannons, and telegraph wires. They came with broken treaties and false promises, and they came in numbers that could not be resisted forever. Geronimo's legacy reminds us that history is written by the victors, but the truth is more complex than any simple narrative. His story is one of courage and tragedy, of resistance and survival, of a man who refused to surrender his dignity, even when everything else had been taken from him. The Apache leader, who was kidnapped from his freedom, now rests far from his homeland. A powerful reminder of the cost of America's westward expansion and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity.